I'm hitting record.
Got
Okay.
it.
Welcome to Tech Empire. I'm your host, Michael Kwet, and we are broadcasting from my place instead of the usual Yale broadcasting studio due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we're launching the second season, and we have on the show none other than Veena Dubal, who will be discussing changes to the transportation industry due to the rise of companies like Uber and Lyft. Veena is a professor of law at the University of California, Hastings in San Francisco. She has been cited by the California Supreme Court, and her scholarship has been published in top-tier law review and peer-reviewed journals, including the California Law Review and the Berkeley Journal of Empirical and Labor Law. Based on over a decade of ethnographic and historic study, Professor Dubal is currently writing a manuscript, Driving Freedom, Navigating Neoliberalism, on how 5 decades of shifting technologies and emergent regulatory regimes change the everyday lives and work experiences of ride-hail drivers in San Francisco. She has also been published in The Guardian, Slate, and the Los Angeles Times, among other places. Veena, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike.
All right, so we're gonna break this show into 3 parts. First, I kind of want to do a one-on-one where we talk about how taxi services work, about how e-hailing services like Uber and Lyft work, and the implications for workers and the taxi industry. I also want to cover events around Uber in California, including Proposition 22, and which will be on the California voter ballot in November. And also, I want to talk about how we can regulate and restructure the use of technology for transportation and ride-hailing. So if we can get through it all, we basically just want to cover, so somebody from listening from the outside who never really looked into what is going on here, they can have the background, they can look at what is going on in the world that's important right now, and then kind of get some vision as to, what we really should be doing instead of what we have right now. But before we jump into it, I want to ask you, where did you start in your studies and how did you wind up working on this issue?
It's a really great question, and the answer, like many answers, is circuitous in terms of how we sort of started working on the things that we work on. After September 11th, I became interested in hate violence that was happening to South Asian and Muslim and Arab communities all over the country. And so I started interviewing taxi drivers because a taxi driver in San Francisco had just been murdered. Paul Singh Sodhi was murdered, soon after actually his brother was murdered in another act of hate in Arizona. And I just started hanging out with taxi workers in the parking lot of the San Jose airport. And I realized very quickly that hate violence was only a small aspect of the larger structural violence that they were experiencing as immigrant men in this country. I didn't know up until that point that you could labor in formal work in the US and go home in debt. And so I sort of, I learned in that moment about the classification and misclassification of workers as independent contractors, and I started organizing with and advocating for taxi drivers, and ended up doing my dissertation on this research. And soon after I filed my dissertation, Uber and Lyft hit the streets of San Francisco alongside Sidecar. This was 2013, 2014, and the first thing that, of course, I noticed or that I experienced listening to the taxi drivers was that almost immediately their already precarious lives became much more precarious, and they were being undermined, economically undermined, supposedly by technology and innovation, and by a discourse of the future, and they did some pretty incredible organizing to stop what was then illegal activity, and they lost the battle, and the regulations that they were fighting in California then spread all over the country and all over the world alongside the business models that the companies were espousing. And so I really got thrown into this work, and it's everything that I sort of know and understand is really shaped by the way workers understand what's happened to them, both in the taxi and the Uber economy. And there have been massive shifts over the past 6 years in terms of how we think about this work. But the fact of the matter is that drivers on the ground, both taxi drivers and Uber drivers, have just had worsening working conditions. And so I've continued to do this both as research. I research self-organized drivers in the Bay Area and the LA area, but I also have been doing a lot of advocacy in the past year to help shift what the regulatory framework is.
All right, interesting. So, yeah, it's interesting to see how people's research evolves, because you don't embark on that particular issue if you started at the beginning saying I'm going to be looking heavily into taxi drivers and work. You might not have thought that you would wind up there. And some of my work, I wound up in South Africa, and I do want to circle back to this issue of the business model, but it's interesting to see how tech has kind of really thrown not a wrench, but it's really just blown up as an issue, and it wasn't anticipated to explode that quickly in the academic spaces early on.
Yeah.
Now, if we're looking at workers and the taxi industry, let's start from kind of ground zero. So once upon a time, if you wanted to get a ride somewhere, if you're in a city, you can wave for a taxi in the street. If you're living in a suburb, a lot of times you would just have to call a taxi cab, right? And
Yeah.
traditionally that seemed like it was, at least to me when I was growing up, it seemed really expensive to do, right?
Yeah.
So you never really did it if you were in the suburbs. And then along came one day a company called Uber. Maybe they weren't the first, I don't know the full history, but I do know that for most people, that was their first introduction to this idea that you can just download an app and somebody will come to you and then you're off on your way. So how would you describe Uber, Lyft, these companies in a nutshell? What distinguishes them? Is the big thing that they are technology companies, and why did they become so overwhelmingly dominant?
Yeah, these are great questions. And let me just start by saying that the reason that it was so expensive to call a taxi, back in the day, or maybe more expensive than public transportation, is because people have to make money to live. So, in order for the taxi companies to be successful, in order for the workers to be able to make a living from their work, fares had to be set at a certain price, because this is an industry in which the amount of overhead is quite expensive. Cars are expensive, gas is expensive, insurance is expensive. There's a lot of wear and tear on vehicles. And so prices were really calibrated to ensure that both companies could, make money, and at least the workers on top could make money. So there are all different layers of workers that existed in the taxi industry. And I don't want to sort of romanticize what the taxi industry was like, because certainly the people who were leasing from the leasers were in very, very precarious positions. But the idea, of course, through fare regulation that came about during the Great Depression, was that consumers had to be charged a price to ensure both their safety and to ensure that the drivers in the industry were making a living wage. So in large cities, municipalities got at this issue by restricting supply, restricting the number of taxis that were allowed to exist on the street at any given time, and by regulating fares. And again, this was always seen as consumer regulation as well as worker regulation. And in the 1980s and early 90s, when we saw some attempts to take away fare regulation, to take away supply regulation, those attempts largely failed because there's not a lot of surplus value in the industry. So when Uber and Lyft and Sidecar, I think Lyft and Sidecar were actually first, when they first started operating, again, on the streets of San Francisco for the first time ever in the world, they didn't get this. So if you look at the stack, the sort of the PowerPoint that their CEO, their eventual CEOs used to pitch this idea to venture capitalists, they didn't understand the industry. They didn't understand how little value there was in the industry. And so I think very quickly what they learned was that the only way to make this work was to do so through exploitation. So what is new about this work is not actually the technology, which as you and your listeners probably know, the technology is just a dispatch technology that was actually available and used in the taxi industry prior to Uber and Lyft. What is new about Uber and Lyft is the business model of having the drivers themselves bear the burden of risk in an extreme way. So the reason that we have such cheap rides right now is both because rides are subsidized by venture capital. These companies have never turned a profit, but also because drivers are earning so little. In California, we know that most drivers are earning less than a minimum wage because there is so much downtime for them because there's an oversupply of drivers in relationship to demand. So what seems extremely efficient to consumers because they get their ride right away or within a short time period for really cheap is actually a hugely inefficient system because, again, these rides are subsidized, the company is losing money, but also the drivers are just driving around, waiting for a fare to be assigned to them. And this has raised, and I know this is a particular issue to you, has raised all kinds of environmental issues that are just now sort of being talked about and discussed 8 years into this industry. So if I could take you back to 2008, 2009, 2010, in the taxi industry, we were in a recession, and the taxi companies alongside some of the taxi worker cooperatives were pushing for a zero carbon impact. So they had these really kind of amazing rules and regulations in place where they were all shifting to hybrid or electric vehicles. The co-op in San Francisco, which is the city that I study, Green Cab was actually any kind of profit that they had, they were using that profit to offset their carbon footprint. Like there was a real attention to environmental issues caused by automobile use. And of course that just got blown out of the water with Uber and Lyft. And so in addition to the extraordinary wear and tear that we see on our streets, the traffic, the congestion that has just become, out of control in the Bay Area, we also saw a real rise in emissions as a result of having cars circling circling, looking for fares.
Interesting. So I want to run some numbers by you, and we'll circle back to that issue of all sorts of issues here with environment and paying a living wage and the viability of this model. But before we do that, so a 2018 Business Insider article reported data that shows Uber and Lyft went from almost 10% transportation market share in 2014 to 72.5% in quarter two of 2018. By comparison, they brought in other industries here. So rental cars went down from 55% in 2014 to 22.3% in 2018. And taxis went down almost 40% and from almost 40% in 2014 to 5.2% in 2018. Do those numbers sound about right to you?
Yeah. I mean, there are a ton of people driving around in their cars trying to make money and often actually losing money in the process. And so, from an economic standpoint and an environmental standpoint, these business models were very quickly devastating.
Okay, and I'm asking that also in part because this is part of the more general gig economy question, because I know I had emailed you and about the question of how much gigafied will the general economy be, and it doesn't seem to be the case that it has exploded, all across everywhere. Like now everybody's a gig worker, right? But
Yeah.
it does seem that at least in the transportation industry that it has been something that has been. Am I right about that? Is it an
That is
outlier?
right.
Is
Yeah,
it
I
an
want to talk
outlier?
about this. Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and I want to talk about this a little bit. So, maybe 4 years ago, there was a lot of speculation that this was going to grow and take over the entire service industry, and everyone was going to be a gig worker. And I think that that did not happen for a variety of reasons, including but not limited to some enforcement. So there were some cases where you had, less consumer interest, more precarious work, and more interest on behalf of regulators, and plaintiffs' attorneys and unions to sort of shut down the misclassification or the gigification of these sectors. And so we sort of saw a slowing down of venture capital in this space. So for a while, venture capitalists were like, oh my God, we're just throwing money at everything that was kind of like Uber. And then it seemed like, for example, there was a home cleaning company that went under because of a misclassification lawsuit. All of a sudden, Uber and Lyft were facing potential regulations in New York City and in California and Seattle. And so I think there was a signal to investors that now is not the time to continue to put money into this economy. And so instead to use Uber and Lyft, because they're such popular consumer services, to use them to do cultural work. So although there was a slowdown in the number or the growth of gig workers and gig companies around 2016, what we've seen since then in the last 4 years is a shift in how a very choreographed shift in how people think about work and work protections. So you've heard a lot in the last 2 years, especially, you've heard these buzzwords, portable benefits. Um, Sometimes you hear the word sectoral bargaining sort of pushed out by the gig companies. You hear that this is innovative, that this is what workers want for the future, that these are just part-time workers. You hear all of this sort of language that's really quite reminiscent of what we heard temp agencies articulate in the post-war period. But what I've argued is that these companies are doing cultural work as well as regulatory work, particularly in these hotspots like New York and California. And if they succeed in in particular, if they can succeed in doing their regulatory work to create space for themselves in operating in the way that they do, then I think that this has the potential to grow, although it has slowed down.
Okay, that's interesting, because if we're looking at what gives them their advantage here, why is it so? Last I checked, Uber was around 71% of the market share for e-hailing, and Lyft had most of the rest.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, if we're looking at the hearings that are going on about monopoly, right? There's a kind of Uber Lyft duopoly in the United States. Now, they're not included. Microsoft also wasn't included. So there's some others. I did want to get your thoughts on that real quick, but before cue that for a second. What gives them such advantage in the tech space? Is it the network effects, so they're not interoperable? If I'm not going to install 10, 20 apps on my phone, different kind of Uber 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And also drivers are not going to be a member of that many different services. So you have network effects there. You could look at the intellectual property. So these are proprietary apps. Do they get any special access to data from the city? Is it the efficiency of their algorithms? What are the set of things that make Uber and Lyft so dominant vis-a-vis other competitors? Obviously, there's the first mover advantage and the VC backing as well. Is that the
Yeah.
sum total right there, pretty much?
Yeah. I mean, I think you articulated that well, and I would just highlight that so much of this is the VC backing. I mean, it is impossible, nearly impossible in environments where they have not yet entered the market to compete with them. And so, um, uh, or environments where they have entered the market to compete with them. And so, when they exited, for example, Austin, when they did a Capitol strike and exited Austin because they were mad about having to do, I think, FBI background checks, there was a more open access sort of cooperative models that popped up and that were successful temporarily. And but then as soon as they came back, Uber and Lyft made those things less popular. So I think that in addition to the VC backing, what has made them really successful, that makes them that other people without that kind of backing or other companies have a hard time scaling is that they operate in all major cities in the world, or at least Uber in the world, and in Lyft all over the US. And so it's like this brand that you can rely on no matter where you are. And their capitalization has also resulted in their ability to market themselves in extreme and in extraordinary ways. Both of these companies have become names that everyone is familiar with. In the same, we use the term Lyft and Uber the way people use Xerox and Kleenex. But more than anything, I think it's the capitalization and their marketing, and also their access. So they, in part because they have so much money, they've had incredible access to regulators, to people who are well situated. Susan Kennedy in California, who was both in Governor Brown's administration and in Governor Schwarzenegger's administration, who's very politically well situated, was fined for illegally lobbying on the part of Lyft. And I understand that she continues to, as maybe even on their board, and continues to lobby on their behalf. But this is someone who knows everyone in California, and anyone who's anyone. And this is true, they hired up all the Obama administration people. Anyone who's anyone in politics has been in some way connected to these companies, and that kind of instrumental power, in addition to their structural power, has been really successful.
So then the business model here, it's been said, and I've read some studies on, I can't remember the name of the person, you might recall, but basically going through and, kind of and systematically interrogating Uber's business model. And look, there's investments from Silicon Valley, rich investors, Wall Street, Goldman Sachs, overseas sources like Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund. And so the question is, and it's been said that their business model is basically go into a market, you're operating at a loss, you're leaking out $1 billion or so a quarter, but what you can do is wipe out the local competition, and then over time, once you've decimated all the competition, you raise the prices back up. Now,
Right.
this would seem to be the word that comes to mind to me is predatory pricing.
Yes.
So the question is, why aren't they just nailed on this? How can they even survive if this is so transparent? And why aren't they being mentioned, or should they be mentioned for something like an antitrust investigation?
Yeah, I mean, they should absolutely be be investigated for antitrust violations. But of course, the way antitrust has been enforced in the U.S. since roughly the 1980s, they're not in the spotlight. We might see a shift in this, but it is absolutely predatory pricing. It's completely transparent, and they've said as much. This information doesn't come from investigative journalists or economists who are uncovering unknown things. This is coming from the companies themselves. Yeah, I mean, they are acting monopolistically. They are offering prices that are lower than market value in order to rope consumers in. And then anytime there is any kind of labor regulation proposed, they say, well, that's going to cause us to raise consumer prices in order to put regulators and the public off. And the reality is that they're going to raise consumer prices anyway. Amazon did the same thing, and they're following a similar model. They're going to raise the prices because they have to. They're operating at a loss.
Now let's talk about the prices and the notion of a living wage, and how what information we have on the living conditions of workers. So you wrote an article called "The Drive to Precarity: A Political History of Work Regulation and Labor Advocacy in San Francisco's Taxi and Uber Economies," and that's at SSRM. And in there you say between the 1920s and the 1970s, taxi driving across the United States was regulated union work. Drivers worked full-time, but not overtime, earned a living wage, and enjoyed the dignities of work and a political voice alongside their union brothers. Can you, or what happened here? So is it easy to determine what an average Uber person works? Is there good data on this? We all have have had the experience of talking to somebody and said, well, I've met Uber drivers and they're very happy with being
Yeah.
an Uber driver, right? And so unless you have some sort of way of separating
Yeah.
out, right, the anecdotes from the person who you also read about who sleeps in their car,
Yeah.
right?
Yep. Yep. So I say this, it's very frustrating to me. I have studied and worked and organized alongside. I've been doing this embedded ethnography alongside organizing Uber drivers for a number of years now. And so whenever I give a talk, someone in the audience will say, "Oh, but every time I talk to an Uber driver, they say this or they say that," and I have a few responses to sort of that anecdotal. Um, uh, Methodology, if you will, and that is that every time you are in an Uber, you are that person's boss. So when you are rating when you rate the person at the end of the ride, you are effectively determining whether or not they are going to continue to be allowed to work on the ride. You're determining what their wages are going to be in the future. You're determining whether they're going to get fares in the future. So much rides on their rating. And so, of course, every time you talk to an Uber driver, or this is what I say to people who tell me this, every time you talk to an Uber driver, they're going to say really nice things because they want a good rating. So there are all kinds of different Uber drivers. The companies, I think the companies, based on the company's own data, they suggest that something like more than 50% of people who try and become a driver, or log on to become a driver, stop doing it within a year. I've read other information that suggests that 70% of people stop doing it after 4 months. So what we really want to hone in on when we're talking about the workforce is we want to hone in on the drivers that are doing it for a long time, who are either stuck with it or they're sticking with it. And those drivers, by and large, are the dependent drivers. And Juliet Shore has come up with this really useful term to think about gig workers. Some of those dependent drivers are full-time drivers. Some of them are part-time drivers, but they are dependent on driving for some basic income, basic needs that they need to have met. And so the vast majority of work on the app is is done by drivers working full-time and more than full-time, even though the vast majority of drivers are themselves um, part-time drivers or casual drivers. And so for these drivers who are doing all of the work and who are working full time, they are in the Bay Area, where wages are generally higher than they are in Southern California, often migrants. So they are people who work in the Central Valley or sorry, live in the Central Valley or live in Southern California and drive up because demand is here and prices are higher here. So I, talked to any number of drivers who are sleeping in their cars, who are showering at 24-hour fitness. This is all pre-pandemic, and who are, like they are truly migrant drivers. You also have a lot of full-time drivers. The vast majority, even the part-time workforce, are immigrant and people of color. So you're talking about a really the most marginalized and vulnerable people in the labor market. They're mostly men. There's some women, more women certainly than there were in the taxi industry, but mostly men. And these are people who maybe were told that they could make a certain amount if they bought a car or leased a car, these earnings guarantees that these companies have, and then very quickly learned that information was not representative or not true, but they were all of a sudden, liable for these payments on their cars. So people really driving in a kind of indentured servitude capacity and with a lot of debt on their neck as they're trying to earn a living. And what's hard is that no Uber or Lyft driver ever in the history of Uber and Lyft have ever earned a raise. So wages are always dropping. So you can be a driver that started in 2016 who continues to drive for Uber and Lyft, and you have only seen your income drop precipitously since the beginning. And so what you end up with is a really who are the people that are going to continue to do this work? It's going to be the people who are most desperate. A lot of refugees, I've interviewed a lot of refugees in the Bay Area, people who have to take care of not just a younger generation, not just children, but who are taking care of older generations, a lot of immigrant families who are also living transnational lives. I mean, really talking about people on the borders of the global labor market who have come here. They're economic migrants that come here for better life, and they end up in this work.
Right, and in that regard, they also wind up running into this issue of these opaque algorithms. You have a piece, an article out called Digital Piecework, and you kind of give some case examples, which is just, you can imagine being in that situation where somebody, that the algorithms change and all of a sudden it's, for example, one example you gave is it's directing you as a driver to a place where you believe, where there's supposed to be a lot of opportunities to pick up people who are asking for rides, and then you show up there and there's nothing. And in that
Yeah.
process, right, you're not getting paid until you secure that ride, right? So when you said there's no such thing as no worker has owned or earned a raise, but you first had wage, right? In that
Yeah.
sense, right, it almost applies there, right? Like, because they're
Yeah.
not they don't have a steady wage, and
Absolutely.
they're not allowing, or they, what they want, what Uber and Lyft and these companies want, is the ability to take that out of the equation so they don't have to pay for that, even though it's a necessary part of the job, right? On the
Yeah.
job.
Yeah.
So, can you speak a little bit to this algorithmic, situation that makes it different than the traditional taxi industry?
Yeah. So this is actually where I think to to give them due credit, and I mean this in the worst way possible, that these companies have innovated. So I don't think that their sort of dispatch technology is particularly innovative, but what they are really good at and what they've done a great job of sort of inventing using digital technologies is tricks. Ways to trick consumers and drivers into making decisions that are good for the company and bad for the workers and the consumers. So I'll just give you two examples that I think are sort of telling about how this happens. So many drivers, like part of, there's this whole economy of influencers and content creators who are teaching other drivers how to make a living doing Uber and Lyft. And the reason that they exist is because there are all kinds of different ways that the companies have created where drivers can game the system, and so like I've talked to a driver who, and this is true of many, many people, but this particular driver had figured out like a trick that he was using. He used it for about 6 months. He said it was working for him. He was gaming the algorithm. He was making bank. He thought this was going to be his future. And very quickly the company switched around the algorithm, so it stopped working for him, and all of a sudden his income was decimated. Sort of the plans that he had made, the financial plans that he had made for his future were out the window, and the predictability that he saw in his work and in his future was just sort of no longer existed literally overnight. Another driver, and this happens to drivers on a daily basis, so wages are fair, the percentage, their commission is super low, so really what drivers try and get are bonuses. That's where the income comes in for them. It's really where their wages are. And so what they get these personalized bonuses where, if you finish 20 rides in 5 days, you'll get $100 or $150 extra. But then when you get closer and closer to that target number, to 20, it gets harder and harder and harder to meet it. And so like one driver just that pops to mind was telling me he was like on a Friday night, super busy part of LA, driving around trying to get his 20th ride so he could get his bonus, and he just couldn't get it. And he was like, what's going on? I'm in a super busy area. I see people waiting for their Ubers and Lyfts. Why am I not getting a ride? And he said, this happens to everyone, like that they use the information asymmetry, the fact that they know you're about to make your bonus, to make it impossible for you to make your bonus. And so in that way, I've compared this to addiction. Like they use behavioral psychology insights combined with algorithms to create a situation in which carrots are often dangled in front of workers such that it always feels like there's hope. It always feels like they could make this work. But in fact, it is a gamble, an everyday gamble, whether or not they're even going to end up with more money than they started the day with after working a long shift.
So I do want to ask a question real quick about, so I want to get over to the Proposition 22 because I think that's really important. But before we do that, I just want to mention quickly, so we can budget our time here, the international context. When I was in South Africa doing my research, I met the metered taxi.
Mm-hmm.
When I went up to Pretoria, I took metered taxi fares or rides, and they hated Uber. And
Mm-hmm.
Uber showed up, I believe it was 2013 in South Africa. By the time you hit 2015, violence is breaking out. Now, there has been violence in the South African taxi industry prior to the arrival of Uber, but it winds up turning into a situation where people are burning each other to death, right?
Mm-hmm.
In addition, because when you're in that situation, in a labor market a post-colonial situation like South Africa, I think if this is from memory, there's like 400,000 taxi drivers, something like that, something like 400,000 teachers, right? So this is a job that I don't want to call taxi driving unskilled, but it's still a job that can be provided by somebody where their livelihood is dependent on it. And when you sweep that out from, I'm not saying that it's more extreme. There are people also who have that precarious situation in the United States. But it didn't surprise me that the extremes of violence that you see going down in places like South Africa, it's going down in Mexico, it's going down in Kenya, from what I've read, that the more extreme the society, right, the more crazy it turns people when they lose that little bit of livelihood that they have. So it
Yeah.
seems as though that this is market expansion, and that the business model here, there's a lot at stake as to setting a norm for society, because if you change the status quo, especially in a place like the United States, which at least some countries like South Africa, will turn to, you're basically setting now a standard that other people and other workers in the world can look at that case example and say, well, but look at how they're doing it there. Why don't we have it this way too? So it seems to me that there's a lot at stake in getting this issue right for workers, you know, in the United States as well. So the question I have then is, if you would like to comment on the Global South context, that would be great. If you have some work on that, or you're aware of some work on that going on. But also, let's start talking about regulation. There's Proposition 22. There was the California Assembly Bill 5 called AB 5. What is the these what is the regulatory situation at the moment? And I know that the Proposition 22 is very contested. The opinion polls show that it's pretty much neck and neck, pro and against. And there, correct me if I'm wrong here, there needs to be a majority to get it through. So what is the state of regulation in California right now, and what are the stakes for Uber and Lyft in the future of the industry?
Yeah, so first I want to say that, Uber and Lyft is the work produced in this economy, and that goes, regulated, but in a way such that workers are excluded from protections, is very much an example of racial capitalism. You have these workers that are on the very margins of the economy. They're mostly people of color. You have experiments that are conducted in the global South with both algorithms and through programs, and that slowly make their way into the U.S. Like, for example, Uber's predatory lending program that they were going to begin in the U.S. I think probably it was put on hold after it got such negative press, but it was first rolled out in Brazil and in India, amongst literally the world's most vulnerable populations. And so in that sense, this work, not just in the U.S. but all over the world, is performed by people who are really just people who are discarded by society, who have just whose state actors have paid little attention to the importance of their lives and livelihoods. And so what is at stake right now in California, I think, is exactly as you said, the creation of either a regulatory system where these workers are included in the formalized labor market, or a system in which they are their informalization is codified, which would then, spread all over the U.S. and probably the world. Again, the first regulations that were ever created around these companies were created in California, and then spread all over the world. And so we know that this is just generally a pattern for these firms. So AB 5 was a law that passed in 2019 that changed the definition of who is an employee in California based on a Supreme Court decision that had come down the year before. And it's not so much, this law wasn't aimed just at the gig economy. It was really aimed at misclassification of workers more generally, because as I've written, for a really long time, different companies like FedEx, for example, had used the definition of who is an employee for purposes of regulatory protections, to carve more and more workers out. So they had been able to evade protections for workers like the minimum wage by using the definition, which was a control definition. How much control did the employer exert in the workplace, and just trying to make it look like they exerted less and less and less control. So AB 5 changed this definition, and the most sort of important aspect of this change was that they said, well, if you are in the same business as your worker, then that person is your employee. Like unless you can say that you're in a different, in a wholly different business than they're in, then you have someone who you are responsible to for the minimum wage and overtime and workers' comp and unemployment insurance. So, and
So that
sorry, go
that
ahead.
would be that would be for example, I heard you say elsewhere, if you're Walmart and you're hiring a plumber, you're not in the same business. So in other
Exactly.
words, they're contractors. And if you're Uber and you're a ride sharing app and you're hiring them for ride sharing, you can't play this pretend game that they're kind of like the plumber.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so the California court in August of 2020 said, in fact, yes, these are all employees and of Uber and Lyft, and the judge ordered a court to treat the workers like employees. Uber and Lyft appealed, and the appellate court stayed the injunction. And essentially, where we're at right now in October is we're just going to wait to see what happens with the ballot measure. So on the November 5th ballot measure, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Instacart, Postmates, they put this ballot measure called Prop 22. It is the most expensive ballot measure in US history. They've put in a combined amount of $184 million to convince the voting public to vote in favor. They have hired PR firms, law firms, political opposition research firms that are known for knowing how to trick and mislead the public. They've lawfully misrepresented themselves and what the proposition actually does in the media, in advertisements. They're flooding every California voter through every avenue they have to convince people to vote in favor of this. And what the proposition would do is legalize a third category of employment that is well below the standards provided by employment in the United States. So workers would not get the minimum wage. They would only get paid during engaged time. That is time when someone is assigned to them, which during the pandemic is something like only 20% of the time. Prior to the pandemic was about 50% of the time. They will not get health care. They would not get workers' compensation. They would not get unemployment insurance. They would not have the right to unionize. And so basically it is the codification of their business model, their exploitative business model, if it passes. And if it passes, I'm afraid that it's going to be exported to every state in the US and all over the world. And this is just going to be a feature of our economy. We're sort of going to lose the protections that workers got, out of the global labor struggles that led to the New Deal.
Now, when you say the for paid for engaged time, we're again talking about this issue that workers do things like drive around and look for rides and things like that. So the Yes on 22 campaign has been very aggressive in trying to promote this idea that those who are in support of AB5 are wrong, and it's not good for workers, it's not good for consumers. If you go to their website, they have a list of talking points. They say 80% of app-based drivers work part-time, you rely on flexible hours. Prohibiting contract work would eliminate hundreds of thousands of jobs. There'd be longer wait times and higher prices for app-based rideshare. And then the positive things for them about Proposition 22 is they say it would guarantee hourly earnings per mile, compensation toward expenses, funding for new health benefits for workers clocking at least 15 hours per week, medical and disability coverage, and some other things. And then they list the interested parties like Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash, but also there are some organizations like a number of NAACP organizations that they list as in support. What do you say in response to their talking points? And can you talk a little bit about their information campaigns?
Yeah, I mean, their talking points are all based on lies. So this idea, all these things that they say that they're going to supposedly offer workers, the healthcare benefits, et cetera, are only available to workers who work for a certain period of time of engaged time. So it's not like I can work 20 hours a week or 40 hours a week and get those things. I have to work who knows how long, because I don't control my own engaged time. They control my engaged time. And so it is very difficult to even estimate how many people are going to get the healthcare subsidies, which is of course less than full health insurance, which they should provide to people who are working more than 30 hours a week under Obamacare. And in fact, I think, based on my sort of rough estimates, I think someone would have to work 60 hours a week, even in a good economy, to get the healthcare subsidies that they're talking about. They don't have hourly wage guarantees. They're only paying for engaged time once again. So, their talking points are, forgive my language, but they're bullshit, and they're really, really pisses me off, because it sounds good on paper and it's just not good. It's really, really, really bad.
Now, I want to shift for the remaining time we have here to the question of models in the broader context, because I think it's really important to question, how we should be interacting with technology and, ride-hailing services. So here we can look at a bunch of issues from different models, like you have platform cooperatives, public utility regulation, and so on. But also the question of cost and the general context. So let's start off with that. Couple weeks ago, Rand Corporation study came out. You might have seen on the share of income that's been captured over the last 40 or so years. The name of the study is called Trends in Income from 1975 to 2018. And it found that from 1975 to 2018, the difference between the aggregate taxable income for those below the 90th percentile, this is in the United States, and the equitable growth counterfactual that they're speaking about there totals $47 trillion. And that if there was equitable growth, keeping pace with productivity, prime age workers in the 25th percentile would be earning 61,000 instead of 33. Workers in the
Wow.
75th percentile who in 2018 earned 81,000 would be making 126,000. And so on. And if you look at it now, we could look at this from a global context and say, American workers in the United States, what the study is basically saying is that the rich have captured all of the income. At the same time, if we were truly just on a global level, not all of that income should be due to people living in the United States, because you're getting, blue jeans from sweatshop,
That's right.
producers and things
Yep.
like that as well.
Yep.
So part of this issue is the question, does it make sense for people to be able to snap their fingers and get a cheap ride somewhere from somebody who's just out there waiting for them? At the same time, we have this issue of inequality where, maybe there is the means to create some sort of reasonable pay for these kinds of services. It seems to me that there's a decontextualization away from that conversation, and that, is this beyond the public to think about? Because it also seems to me that the public is very happy right now, the middle and upper classes are very happy right now to be able to walk around or sit in their house and have somebody just show up. So what is the deal with this? I mean, is it something that is ultimately feasible, or is this something that, really actually should be something that is done on, less frequently? Because it's kind of like everybody having a house worker, right? To clean
Yeah.
their house for them, right? Like,
Yeah.
is that really in a just society something that we really would have? Or would that be something that is more niche and that fills in when you're elderly and disabled and now you have a house worker come, or you're in a tight situation, so now you have somebody who can come and help you, drive to somewhere, and so on. So I want to ask, first of all, about the general context there, and then maybe talk a little bit about the platform cooperatives, public utility regulation, and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So yes, this is. I mean, I generally think that it is not so bad to have a service in society where someone has to, someone takes someone else's body from point A to point B, as long as that is not that service is valued, and someone is able to make a good living off of it. In the state that we are in the way that this work exists, both in the taxi industry prior to Uber and Lyft, and in the in the in the Uber and Lyft industry, what you have are these sort of atomized, subservient workers who are not able to, in any way, shape, or form, even make a minimum or living wage, much less what they actually deserve for the important work that they are doing. And I think you're right that it's important to think about this through global value chains of capital, not just in terms of the commodities that go into Uber and Lyft. The data labeling that's done by workers in Madagascar, the cars that are produced by workers in China and India, the gasoline that comes from elsewhere. There's all sorts of ways that we can map out the commodities that make this, that and all of the labor that goes in, the exploited labor that goes into even the creating the infrastructure of this work, and how workers might find or have solidarities with global workers everywhere who are part of these value chains. But I think it's also worth noting that the workers all over the world who are doing this particular type of work, who are engaged in this sort of um, subservient gig work, they are themselves organizing with one another. So in January, there was an app-based driver conference, all for drivers from Nigeria and India and South Africa and Europe and the US, and they all got together to compare notes about their experiences. So just in the same ways that capital coordinates to create these exploitative conditions and to maximize revenue and profits, these workers had the opportunity to meet and talk, and they are talking, and I don't mean to say that they will succeed in any way, and I don't want to romanticize sort of their power, because they don't have a lot of power, but I do want to just say that that and give credit where credit is due, that they are thinking about these things. They're thinking about the data. They're thinking about the environment. They're thinking about all the things that we've discussed here, and so it's not just us as academics who are sort of making these observations about the value chains and about how work should or could be, but it is the workers themselves who are envisioning different futures.
So, I mean, to me, it sounds like we're just not sure, right, exactly what's feasible, without doing some really serious, in-depth, probably number crunching and guesses about that issue. But the models, then I want to close on asking about some models here, because when I first learned about Uber exploitation, Lyft, and these companies, the first thought that came to mind was, well, why don't cities just have their own app, and then the taxi services that are there can all plug into it, and if you can have 10 taxi, 5 taxi services, whatever, that are in your city, each one of them could be on the app. You don't have the interoperability problem, because unlike, say, social networking, this is really confined into like a geographic space. You can open source it so that development in one city can be shared and taken in by another city. All you need is the architecture and administration in the background. Why isn't there just like, New York City, San Francisco,
Man, I've been talking about this for a long time. I think that absolutely the path forward is, there are two paths forward. There's the platform cooperative path, and then there's the public option path. And I really think that the public option path here is the way to go. I think the way to do this equitably, to make this work that is good work, to create better jobs, even for people, sort of infrastructural jobs, the people who are creating the architecture of the services themselves, to do this so that it is good for the environment. Like this needs to be controlled by municipalities, and it's completely possible. I think that our governments are just so in awe of technology and of venture capitalists that both they imagine it to be impossible, and they think of this as a space that necessarily needs to be privatized, which is just not the case. We're dealing with people's bodies. Taxis were long considered public utilities for a reason, and this is something that I think cities and the people who live in cities in particular would really benefit from having this as integrated into public transportation systems.
And the advantage of a kind of public municipal owned option over a platform cooperative, what would be the reason to go with one or the other?
Just because there's very little surplus value in this industry, and so from the sort of the incentives that are developed through a private entity, including a platform cooperative, I think just wouldn't serve either the workers or the public in a way that makes sense. I mean, many taxi companies were cooperatives, and yet you still saw multiple levels of exploitation. And so this is just an industry that I think would thrive through as a public utility.
Sure. All right, Veena, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for coming on to the show. We will see what happens in the upcoming vote.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed. I think it looks okay. Am I right?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. It looks okay.
And you're coming out with a book at some point in the near future.
Maybe next year. Yep.
Okay. Well, I'll keep my eye out for it, and stay in touch. And thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you, Michael. This is so great. And thank you to your listeners. Be well.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.